right? And so folks, you may or may not want to have your camera on while we're doing this. Some people are okay, but if you want to turn your camera off during the presentation, because it will be recorded, just to remind you of that. And let's see.
Will the presentation be available after the class for download?
Yes, Phil will be putting that on his extension website, I believe, and they have a YouTube site, so will be available. So let me start from the beginning. Hoping all of you can see that. All right. All right, as Phil mentioned, I'm a Virginia Master Naturalist, and 5 or 6 years ago, I would have never thought anything about doing maple syrup. But after our first class of Master Naturalists in High Knob chapter graduated, which was December 2015, Phil started this project for volunteers to do some maple syrup production. So we started in January 2016. It was a demonstration for non-timber forest products that citizens can produce. The goal was to demonstrate how to identify the maples, how to tap them in such a way to preserve the health of trees, and how to process the sap into syrup. And our Virginia Master Naturalist chapter volunteers have been in all phases of the collection and the production. This will be our 6th winter doing this. So my plan is to share some of the things I learned, some of the mistakes we made, and hopefully get you started if you want to start making syrup on your own. So why make maple syrup? Well, it might give you a little source of some extra income, maybe selling it at a farmer's market, whatever. Could be just be a hobby or novelty. Might make good Christmas gifts to people, friends or family, to have homemade syrup. There is a component in Wise County. We were interested in our tourism and trying to promote this and help our economy in some ways. Some parts of Virginia have maple syrup festivals, and the potential is here in our area to maybe do this. Be off-season enterprise for particularly farmers because there's not much you can grow during the season. This is a winter process. And the opportunity in our county, I know some of you are in other parts of Virginia and in other states, but in Wise County, in our mountains here, it's estimated there are nearly 1 million sugar maples and over 2.5 million red maples. So potential is there to make a lot of syrup. Possibilities also is you may not have trees, but you may have neighbors have trees and are willing to let you use them. We have national forest land that has maple trees that maybe permits can be gathered to do that. And also it's possible to get involved in maple syrup without cooking it. If there are other folks that have ways of processing, you collect the sap, and then for a fee, they can produce the syrup for you. So we're looking at various ways of acquainting folks in our region with the opportunities that maple syrup production can offer. One of the other reasons, and I wasn't aware of this till we started the project, are the health benefits possibly of maple syrup. Now it is a sugar, and I should emphasize that too much sugar is not good for you. But look at the antioxidants in this table, comparing maple syrup with things like broccoli, bananas, carrots, which we know are vegetables that we're supposed to eat for good properties and all. One study found that there could be as many as 24 different antioxidants in maple syrup. Another study I researched found that if you could replace all the refined sugar in an average diet and replace it with maple syrup, it would increase your total antioxidants as much as eating a serving of nuts and berries. But remember, again, syrup is mainly sugar, and sugar intake should always be monitored for a healthy diet, just because it looks healthy. You don't want to overindulge in your syrup. Another table here shows the minerals contained in maple syrup as compared with other commonly used sweeteners of corn syrup, honey, brown sugar, white sugar, and maple syrup just blows all of them away in terms of the items there. If you look at calories, it's comparatively lower than most of the things there, except for white sugar. Interesting, honey we think of as a natural sweetener and being maybe better for us, and it is compared to brown sugar, white sugar, corn syrup. But again, maple syrup with the minerals that it contains clearly is more helpful for that reason. So what is maple syrup? Well, it's defined as a thick, sweet liquid. It's made from sap extracted from maple trees, primarily from sugar maple. And to produce it, the sap has to be processed with heat to concentrate it to a 66% sugar by weight. So that's the process. You've got to have maple trees, you got to get the sap, and you got to understand how to process it to turn the sap into actual maple syrup. And there's the steps just outlined that we're going to go through tonight. We'll drill holes in maple trees in late winter, maybe early spring, depending on your climate. Climate patterns have a lot to do with this. And the season, I should point out, has been changing over the years due to a trend toward warmer winters. Once you collect the sap, you want to filter it to remove debris. Then it's boiled until sugar content reaches that 66% or 66 bricks, as we'll learn it's sometimes called. Then you filter again to remove any impurities and you bottle it. And if you're doing bottling of syrup for selling it, you want to follow certain safety procedures. A lot of the information here I'm getting from a great handout from Virginia Tech that they did on producing maple syrup for farmers markets. And I'll show that publication at the end of my presentation tonight. They used a lot of some of the research that we did and some of the photos we did, they used in their publication. So we need to find our maple trees. So here are some things in the maple family. They have the very distinctive leaves to identify. And it's not too hard to identify your maple trees in the summer when the leaves are on. The problem is this time of year after the leaves have dropped, if you've got a wooded area, it becomes a little more of a challenge. So identifying your trees might be best done in summertime so you know where the maples are. We have sugar maples, red maples, silver maples, and the bottom right corner is a box elder, which is technically in the maple family, and box elder trees can make a fine, what would be still considered maple syrup. But they aren't commonly used. The most commonly used are the sugar maple and the red maple. And here's another photograph of some of the leaves of the maple. Sugar maple on the left. Notice the leaves, if you go around the lobes of the leaves, they're very smooth. When you compare that to the other species, you have these jagged teeth in the red maple and even more pronounced some in the silver maple tree. But all maple trees can be used to make maple syrup. It's just that the natural sugar concentrations in the sap of sugar maples on average is higher than some of the other maples, although each individual tree will have its own characteristics and sugar concentrations can vary quite a bit from tree to tree, even within the same forest area. Maple producers communicate by the number of taps they put on the tree. These are the holes that are drilled in order to get the syrup, the sap to come out. How many taps should go on a tree? There are different methods for depending on this. You can find some information that some producers might put 2 taps on a tree regardless. I think some go by a diameter limit. You want a tree at least 10-inch diameter or larger for tapping. And you can find charts that say if it reaches this diameter, you might put 2 taps on the tree. If it's this, you might put 3. A rule of thumb that we learned from a fellow a few years ago was if you can reach around the tree, it's good for 1 tap. If you can almost reach around but can't quite do it, then 2 taps are a possibility. And if it takes 2 of you to reach around the tree, then it's possible you might consider 3 taps. I will tell you that most of the trees that we've been tapping, we've just put in 1 tap. Occasionally we put in 2, but we really didn't find that much added sap production from the trees that we had 2. I remember first year we had a tree that we put in 3 taps in. It was a big, huge maple tree, but it produced very little sap compared to some of the other trees. So sometimes you just don't know what a tree will produce. The process of why this works involves some physics and biology and a combination of things, but why this is done in the winter. We need below freezing temperatures. When the temperature falls to near below freezing, the pressure inside the tree becomes negative in relation to atmospheric pressure, and the maple will force sap up from the roots up into the tree. Then as the following day, the temperature warms above freezing, the pressure reverses and that sap flows downward. And that's where you start collecting the sap. So the weather plays a big part in maple syrup production. We must have this cycle of below freezing evenings, nights, followed by above freezing weather. And so when that occurs most often, those are the times you're going to get the best flow of sap. It takes a lot of sap to make syrup. On average, 1 gallon of syrup requires about 40 gallons of pure maple syrup or maple sap, maybe 60 gallons of red maple sap. Our experience has been tapping about 30 to 40 trees those first few years. We were averaging maybe about 55 gallons of sap, and these were red maples and sugar maples combined. About 55 gallons roughly of sap was going to boil down to make 1 gallon of syrup. That's one of the constraints about making your syrup. It takes some time to boil all that sap to the required sugar content. As mentioned earlier, we don't tap trees smaller than 10-inch diameter, and the sap will flow when temps are below freezing at night, well above freezing in the day, and you can make the syrup from any maple, red, sugar, silver, even box elders. That is still maple syrup. And we can also make syrup from other trees. A couple years ago, we started doing a walnut experiment. We made some very tasty syrup from black walnut. There's a gentleman speaking tomorrow, I believe, on birch syrup. And today our group went out and we started tapping some sycamore trees to see if we can have any luck producing enough sap to make syrup from sycamores. So some of your basic equipment. You're going to need some kind of spout or spile. Of course, you'll need a drill as well to drill the holes in the tree, but you'll need some spouts or spiles as they're referred to. They can be plastic, they can be metal, they can even be wooden. One advantage of metal is that they can be reused, but most folks nowadays are using the plastic because you can attach plastic tubing to fit on them and more easily run them into collection buckets or jugs. Here's some collection methods that we've used. The good old milk jug, just clean it out, sterilize it well, and they make a great container. The spile is the black item there, and then we got the blue tubing that runs into the milk jug. There's another one where we use a plastic bucket. Similar principle, the spile's been tapped in and then the tubing runs it. One of the advantages of these is that you can keep lids on them, and keep debris and rainwater out. On the right is a metal collection. This is an interesting thing. It uses a metal spile. It's got a metal cover on it, but still some things can blow into it on that. It just hangs from that metal spile. The problem with some of the metal buckets and all is that they will eventually corrode in time, and that could be an issue. So that metal bucket was used by a student project at UVA Wise, I believe. A few years ago, they were doing some research and they got those metal buckets. We've stayed to the plastic containers. In fact, here's Phil's office, and you can see before he went out there, we've got well equipped with a bunch of buckets and lids and the tubing and all that we need to work on our project. We'll also need to provide a method of cooking sap. As we said, sap has very little sugar content to start with, and we've got to boil away most of the water till it reaches 66%. There's different ways to do that, and the latter part of the talk will go into that in more detail. The first half is going to be on collecting the sap and storing it, and then we'll talk about processing it later. We do need good pots and pans. Stainless steel works well, and you want to have things that have a large surface area to make it easier to boil away the excess water. So here we are, our first year, drilling in some tapping the trees. We decided on 5/16 inch spouts. You can get some with or without little check valves. The check valves are a little ball valve in there that keeps them from backing up. I don't think it's a necessity, but we had those to start with. You drill your hole about 1.5 to 2 inches. And it could be straight or at a slight angle. As you drill the hole, you want to make sure that you pull out the wood shavings. Use the drill back and forth to get the wood shavings out and get a clean hole there. We marked our drill bit with tape so that we could get an idea of when we reach that 1.5 inches or 2 inch on there. And then the spiles are gently tapped in with a hammer. It's what's called tapping. You don't pound them in forcefully. You gently tap them, and you'll hear a change in the pitch if you listen while you're tapping to know when it is in the right location. It'll change pitch just a little bit. You don't want to force it in or pound it in too far. So there's a little bit of knack with that, but we were able to accomplish it pretty easily based on what we were told to do. You will have that little sound as you tap the spile in. Here we are now. We were attaching tubing to the ends of the spile, so then they would go into collection buckets that were tied onto the tree. And some other pictures. Our first winter doing this is we were out in the cold. You can see the snow. This is the first week in January for our location that we started doing our tapping. Probably 40 years ago, we would have maybe waited till the first week of February. That's how much the climate has changed over the years, and it's not just in our area. I know a research site up in Ohio, which is my home state. I saw the person that was doing this is near Dayton, and she was commenting on the fact that when she was doing this years ago, it was done much later in the season. There was about a month difference between when we're tapped trees 40 years ago and when we're tapping trees today. So here we are. We have a rather steep slope, and we'll talk more about that later on. One problem with this is getting up and down these slopes to collect the syrup later on became quite a job for us. Again, we tapped close to 40 trees, I believe. Here's some more examples of the trees. Here's one where we're emptying the container into a bucket. And I believe that some of the sap may be frozen in this point, and that's okay. If the sap freezes, that's not a problem. It'll stay good. In fact, it's probably better than if it gets too warm and all, because we need to check the buckets regularly. If any sap is collected during a warm spell, we need to get it refrigerated to keep until we have enough to start cooking it. The sap itself This little funny picture here. It basically tastes like water. You think, oh, it's going to be sweet. I'm going to be able to taste it. No, I've tasted the sap, and it's just like drinking water. Unless your mind might tell you it has a little hint of sweetness, it's the little bit of sugar that's in the sap is not enough to register on most of your taste buds. You know, so sap should be kept cold or frozen until ready to be cooked. As temperature rise, microorganisms could grow in collected sap, and that would lower the quality of the syrup. And the sap itself might spoil and might have to be discarded. If you go out and find sap that is not clear or it has kind of an off smell on it, you probably don't want to use it. In fact, toward the end of the season, as things warm up, the sap that will be collected won't be of the quality that you would use to make the syrup. Okay, we're going to take a little pause here. I should have said something about entering questions before I started. We have the chat box, and if you have some questions, we can put those in, and then Phil or someone can read. I can't see the chat box of my screen, but if someone would read the questions, we can try to answer any questions you might have at this point.
Chris, you have a question. Can you leave taps in year round?
Basically, you want to remove them. The tree, when you tap it, immediately after you drill that hole, that tree is going to start to try to heal itself. And that's another reason why you only get about maybe 6 weeks at most time when you can. So leaving the taps in is probably not a good idea. We pull our taps at the end of the season. Of course, we're using plastic taps. And one thing about it, if you're going to tap a tree repeatedly, you want to move those tapping locations around. You don't want to tap in the same area from the previous year. You want to move at least 6 to 12 inches if you can to a different location there. I've seen some taps that have been left in. There were a couple, it wasn't our group, but some folks that tapped some trees down by the Powell River Project a few years ago, didn't collect all their taps, and now the trees grown completely around them. They were metal taps, and the tree just grew completely around them. So no, you're not going to be able to reuse where you tapped the previous year. So it's best to pull the taps out.
Okay, you have one that says, how warm can the temperature get before you want to think about running out to save what's sitting in the buckets?
Basically, we kind of watch them every couple of days. I think you don't want to go a real long time period if it's warm weather. Now, cold weather, they can stay frozen in the bucket for quite a while. We had a cold snap. We had a couple cold snaps those first couple of years we were tapping where we had the polar vortex coming in, and you didn't get any sap flow on those days. If it gets stays below freezing all day long, you're not going to get anything flowing. And the sap in our buckets froze, and it stayed fine. We didn't have trouble. But if you get those warmer times, I would say no more than a couple days to get that sap in. That would be my estimate. Well, maybe someone else knows, has experience, but you're running a risk of contamination if you let it sit too long.
Someone asked, how many times can you tap the same tree?
Well, I'm thinking as long as you carefully move those taps around, it's kind of indefinite as long as the tree reasonably stays healthy and all. I haven't seen it. I haven't run across anything that says, well, you can only tap so many times or so many years. I know there are trees that are being, of course, we've only been doing it for, this will be our 6th year. And we've stopped tapping the first location where we were tapping our maples. We moved away from that location. But as far as I know, again, be something maybe you could look up, find. I have not seen any issues with, as long as you carefully move your taps and rotate them around, you should be okay.
Someone asked, should you treat the holes in some way to avoid hurting the tree after you remove the taps?
We have not done that. There might be some folks that do that. It's kind of like, sapsucker holes. They leave little holes in trees, and as long as you're not doing it, the tree's going to scar. It's not going to really heal, but it's going to form a scar where that hole was located. And we have not done anything to treat or fill those holes in.
I had a question. He says, I'm in Richmond. When should I tap sycamores? I understand that you started tapping in your area.
Yeah. In your area, I don't know. We're learning on sycamores. We tapped a couple last year, later in December, I think, and found that we didn't get much of a flow. And everything we've seen says you tap them much earlier than you tap your maple trees. You tap them before Thanksgiving or around that time before doing the maples. So we don't have results yet to say what has been done. Now, if anyone in your area has done sycamores, can't find a whole lot of information about that. Maybe one of our experts tomorrow who's doing some other tree series, alternate tree series, might have some information about that. It's probably a question we'll have to ask tomorrow as well. So it's a good question, but I'm sorry, we really don't have much of an answer right now. Just try it and see what happens, I guess, and figure out what the timing is in your location.
Somebody says, I know it varies with the season and weather, but how fast does the sap run? For example, how much sap might you expect in a 2-week period?
Gosh, I'm thinking we got 50 gallons at one time in about a week, didn't we, Phil?
Yeah. At one point we probably filled up a 55-gallon barrel and overnight one time, but that was 40 trees.
Yeah, that was 40 trees, right? We filled a barrel almost overnight there. It can really vary, and sometimes it's surprising. We thought the weather wasn't quite right for a good flow, and then we went out and found quite a bit. So the trees can surprise you sometimes. With that, we had our walnut buckets, I don't think overflowed any, but they came close a couple times. Conditions.
Somebody asked, is tapping on, it shifted on me, is tapping on the southern sunny side of the tree, does that improve the yield and the flow?
We don't know. I'm thinking it might have that'd be something to do more research on. Sometimes it's just tapping where you can get a good foothold. You saw the mountainside that we were on. Sometimes it's just a matter of getting a good location where you could drill and tap in. But that's a question I was asking as well. I don't think it makes a whole lot of difference from what I've seen from other presentations that I've attended. I've not seen anybody talk about that, but it could be something to research.
Because somebody had asked, can you freeze until you get a chance to boil it down? But then she said that I think she picked up the answers in the presentation there. So,
okay. Right.
Another question, is there a certain height on the tree you should tap?
Not really. One thing you got to think about are maybe critters that get to your collection. We'll talk later on where we're using lines, collection lines and all. Then you want those high enough that maybe a deer can go under and things. But as far as just using buckets and all, just put them at a convenient height, I think is fine. It doesn't matter. They can be higher or lower. That really doesn't seem to have much effect on the amount of sap you're going to get.
And then a question, how long does the freeze and warm cycle need to be before you tap? How long does it need to be going on before you tap?
Well, I don't know. I know some people were tapping in late December last year because we got a spell of weather that you look at the forecast and you see all of a sudden you got all these days where it's 20 overnight and then it's 40 the following afternoon. If you see a forecast like that coming up, then it's probably a good idea to get your taps in, because that's probably the ideal weather pattern you want to find. In our case, it's just a matter of when we can get people together to go out and do the work. Now, if it's on your own property, you can plan a little bit of when is a good time to go out and take care of it. But weather forecast would help you, I guess, decide when it's time to get your taps in.
Okay, that's all that's in the chat.
All righty. Thank you. Those are all very good questions. Wish I had more precise answers, but again, I'm learning as well as everyone else on doing this procedure. Okay, so let's move along into, we've collected our sap. We've got enough of it. We need to turn it into syrup. So how is that done? Well, the sugar content of sap can vary 1% up to 3%, maybe somewhere on the average around 1.5%, 2%, depending on the species of trees and how good the summer weather might have been for it. The more crown and leaf area the trees have, the higher the sugar content. So those that are going into production on this seriously need to think about best ways to treat their maple trees during the growing season in order to maybe thin out competitors and give the tree room to leaf out and produce a good sugar content. And it's called syrup if you get it up to 66% sugar, or what's called in the industry brix, B-R-I-X, which is just another term for the percent of sugar. There are a couple ways to determine this, and we'll talk about more later on. One way is a temperature method. When boiling, the temperature when it reaches approximately 7 degrees above boiling point of water, that's when you've got your 66%. You can also use, as shown in the picture, other devices. A refractometer is shown in there. That's a little bit of expense to get one of those, but that can give you a reading of the sugar content of both your sap and then later on of your boiled syrup. Here is the first year we were learning to do this. We were working with the extension folks up in Whitesburg, Kentucky, and they have a very elaborate setup up there where they were tapping trees and had some very professional high-grade equipment there. I put in this slide to show they're boiling the sap there, and you see all the steam in there. This is something you probably don't want to do in your kitchen or in your home. Not on this scale. All the moisture coming up from that. It's one thing to build yourself a little sugar house and do it in or do it outdoors, but you can see it's a lot of process to boil that down. Essentially, we experimented with some different outdoors. First year, we actually used propane. And we got ourselves a decent size stainless steel tank that would hold about 50 gallons or so with a large surface area, that rectangular tank. The problem was heating with propane, it's hard to get it hot enough and it took a long time to get the temperature you wanted. So a good wood fire we found was the best way. We experimented with some different devices. One was set up outdoors, worked pretty well for us to cook it down. Here's another stove that we put inside a barn up the Powell River project. A fellow worked up there, converted an old wood stove and fixed it up for us so we could put the container with the syrup on top. Notice our coffee pot there. We definitely needed that. This takes a lot of time and we got to keep the fire going. And it probably will involve overnight cooking if you can do it that way. We were not able to do overnight cooking because of our location, so we'd have to boil as much as we could one day, get the fire down, pour the sap back into a cooler, chill it overnight, then come back in a day or two and start the fire up again and cook it again. One aspect of that is that when you reheat like that, it will darken the color of the sap somewhat, but it really doesn't have much an effect. It's minimal effect on the taste. You can still make good tasting syrup, but it takes a longer time to do that. Here we are, one of our master naturalists doing some wood chopping there. Again, taking some time to boil it down. Now, there are some ways to shorten this process called reverse osmosis. And tomorrow will be some discussion about how you might want to make your own reverse osmosis from scratch. You can also purchase, if you're into this for big time production, then it's worth the investment. The reverse osmosis removes a good deal of the water, but leaves all the sugars and minerals and all the good stuff in, and quickly shortens your time for boiling it. But there we are doing that. Now, at some point, as it boils, there's a little bit, you don't stir it, but you can maybe get a little bit of, skim it a little bit off the top there. At some time, you might want to move it into smaller containers to give you more control as it thickens. We would move it sometimes in a smaller container, gives you more control. And one thing you got to watch as it reaches and nears the point of being completed, it might be easy to burn the syrup and let it go too far. And so rather than risk that, we would often move it to a smaller container. We sometimes finished it over low propane heaters and all there. And again, the syrup we're showing there really isn't syrup yet. It's still sap. It hasn't darkened enough, but we check it from time to time carefully and keep boiling it down. Our method, for the most part, was to use a candy thermometer to measure the finishing temperature. How do we know when we've got it to that 66%? And the rule is that basically at about 7 to 7.5 degrees above the boiling point of water, then you have reached that magical, it is now maple syrup at the 66 Brix. Normally, boiling point of water, we learn in school at sea level is 212 Fahrenheit. And so you'd say, well, 219.5 degrees on your candy thermometer would tell you it's done. But living in the mountains where we are, the higher elevation changes your boiling point, as does the barometric pressure. So the best thing to do is to boil some water, bring water to a boil on the day that you're cooking, and get the temperature that water's boiling, and then add your 7 to 7.5 degrees to get your temperature that you want to use to learn your finishing point of the syrup. The guidelines here for finishing and bottling, these are guidelines that our extension publication uses, particularly for those that are going to be selling or marketing their product. They recommend that maybe you do get the refractometer to be a little more precise, to make sure your percent of syrup is correct. If it's Brix less than 66 and you don't refrigerate, that syrup could spoil if it's just bottled the normal way. If it has a Brix more than that, you may get sugar sand or sugar crystals forming within the container. They don't harm the product. They're just not as aesthetically pleasing as the pure syrup when that happens. So the recommendations are, once you reach syrup, then you need to filter it again. And again, if you're doing this for retail, you probably want to invest a little bit in filtering materials that are approved for that from syrup producers. Now, if you're just doing it for your own personal use, using some cheesecloth is probably fine for that as well to do the filtering. I'll show some pictures in a minute. You want to bottle the syrup while it is hot, 185 to 190 degrees. Put it in clear sanitized bottles. You can use canning jars. You can get commercially available fancy containers if you're going to market this. Those things are available. We got some little plastic jugs that Phil got for us that used and worked fine. Some of our other master naturalists I know put them in pint jars or quart jars. You can do it. So you reheat it. If the bottling temperature drops below at 180, and you want to minimize airspace in the tops of the bottles. Here is one way of filtering. We're just using cheesecloth here to filter the product. This is filtering before it's syrup. This isn't syrup yet. It's getting close, but we filter it before we did the final cooking to reach that. It was close at this point, and we wanted to filter out anything before putting it on to heat it to get that 7.5 degrees above boiling temperature of water. Here we are filtering using one of the professional filters, I guess, approved filters and all, and looks like a 5-band job there. Pretty much, I think you can do it more easily. But again, this is our second year of making syrup when we were doing this. So here we are filtering the syrup, getting ready to eventually bottle it. Now the bottling process, this is in Whitesburg that first year. We took some of our sap up there, and Phil is filling up some of our containers. They had a professional finisher piece of equipment there that would heat it to the desired temperature, and then a nice little spout there, and we could fill that. But we didn't have the funds to get equipment like that for our job, and so we thought a little bit about it and realized a coffee urn might be a good alternative to that, to heat the syrup up to where we could easily pour it into our containers and bottle it. So here we are. This is our second year. We've done that since then, taking syrup and heating it up to the desired temperature in the coffee urn, and then getting it into our bottles. And this worked out pretty well. We finished up a nice little set of syrup. Once this is sealed, and if you have taken the care to get true 66 bricks or better, it should keep indefinitely. If you're not sure about that level, then it's probably best to keep your syrup refrigerated for your own personal use. But if you're going to be marketing the syrup, that 66% is very important, because if you're under that, this syrup might go bad on you. It might turn a little bit, it might ferment a little bit. In fact, we had one batch that we produced that unfortunately we realized when we tasted it about a year later, tasted a little bit off. And we checked it, and by that time we had a refractometer and found out, oops, we didn't quite get that to 66 bricks. We were able to salvage some of it, but we lost some as well that we thought, well, that's not too palatable and all. So that's one of the things to keep in mind as you're making your own syrup. Now, if we had refrigerated our product, it would have kept well in the refrigerator and wouldn't have gone off like it did when it was bottled, and it wasn't quite at the sugar level that it was supposed to be. All right, so that concludes our cooking and bottling, and time for a few more questions. So Phil, you're still muted there. Paxton or somebody can read the question box. Anybody have any questions in the chat box that you'd like to ask at this point? Hello, Tokyo. Are you still there?
There was no new ones. There was a question, but Phil answered it.
Oh, okay. All righty. Well.
Oh, wait a minute. Here's
okay.
For a small batch producer at home, would a deep fried turkey setup be with propane, etc., be a good starting set of equipment?
I have seen references to people doing that. We haven't tried that ourselves. But I think it would work. In fact, there are some how to make syrups that will do that on a small basis. The other thing I didn't mention is that if you're doing small batches and you boil down to the level where you're getting close, it would be okay to bring it in and put it on your kitchen stove in a stainless steel pot of some kind to do the final boiling of it for a small amount. That shouldn't pose a problem by that point. In fact, we did some finishing in the little kitchen area of the extension office one time.
And Chris, I'll mention, I believe there's a commercial producer in the group from Kentucky who uses propane. And I won't call him out, but if he
No.
to comment on
No.
it, he.
No, I can see where propane would be good for our setups. We weren't able to build a device easily enough to it was a slow process. My memories of the year when we were using propane is that
Yeah, I remember constantly refilling those tanks. I was done with it after that first year, but
yeah.
but a lot of people are happy with it. So
Yes, it will work. And I think one thing I will mention for those of you that are trying to research this, a little trick I learned a little while back, when you put in, say you're using Google search or something to try to find sites, do you know about the adding learn, LEARN, .edu to your searches so that you bring up university related research that has good practices and good information, because nowadays anything's true on the internet. You can find all kinds of things, and we've been looking primarily at sites by various universities and extensions to get good information about best practices in terms of making syrup. That's one little trick to think about when you're searching if a turkey cooker is appropriate for making syrup and all. I have seen some things where they can be used if you're careful with them.
okay, Woody did comment. He said that he built an enclosure out of block and uses food service pans with the propane, and it works great.
Yeah,
And he share some photos of his setup, and so if anybody wants to see that later on, I'd be glad to share that. And Tom Hammett, who I'll introduce, he's a co-conspirator in this. He's Tom Hammett from Virginia Tech, has helped us plan all these syrup schools over the last few years. He says he also uses a turkey fryer.
Okay, so that's good to know. We may
And
need
food service pans are really helpful.
Yeah, food service pans definitely. Almost all the sites I've seen definitely emphasize that. Okay, any other questions? All right. Well, I've got a few more things just to look at here. The first year we did this, one of our drawbacks of using the buckets, and especially on the terrain where we were located, the Powell River project, was it was a lot of work going up and down those slopes, emptying out the buckets and then carrying it back up to where we could do. So there are some better methods. So here's some things we did in year 2 that we can talk about. If you've got a lot of trees, now if you just got a few trees that you got easy access to, the bucket method will work pretty well. But if you are wanting to do this on a larger scale, it's worth the investment into using the plastic tubing in order to run lines, especially where we live with the grade that we have, produces a natural vacuum and actually produces more sap, pulls out more sap from the tree than just the bucket method. In flat areas, people would put pumps on them, on the lines, to draw it out to create a vacuum. We don't have to do that here in Southwest Virginia. We can get the natural vacuum just from the steep slopes where a lot of our trees are located. So here's Team Maple putting in some lines. Notice we are tapping higher up the tree because we need to try to get lines high enough that the deer running through won't be running into them. Here's a little close-up of the procedure here. We put a 5/16 tap there in the top, ran a 5/16 piece of tubing down, and then we have some connectors that eventually connected into a 3/16 diameter tubing, which we found was a better conveyor in terms of creating a better vacuum. Now it is possible to get spiles. In fact, we started using them today with our sycamores that are They're 5/16 going into the tree, but the output is a 3/16, so we don't have to do that extra conversion step of stepping down from 5/16 to 3/16. It saves us a little bit of time to do that. And then you put several trees. We get up to 10 or 12 trees maybe on one line coming down, and they flow into one central collection area. You'll see that in a minute. Here's some equipment that was from today's excursion when we went out doing our sycamores. We have a large roll of the 3/16 tubing. There on the back of Phil's pickup, we've got our drill, we've got the clippers to clip the tubing, and the bags of spiles and connectors. And the close-up on the bottom is the tool, as we call it, but it's a nifty little gadget that will clamp onto the tubing, and then you can use it to put in the spile or connecting the T connectors or whatever as you're connecting together. Because in cold weather, it's a heck of a job to try to get that tubing onto the spile. And a little device like this saves us a whole lot of time and effort and all that. So if you're doing the tubing procedures, it's worth the investment to get a device, something like this, to speed up that process. We treat that tool very carefully, always make sure we don't leave it somewhere behind. Bill, you did get it today, right? And brought it home with you, I hope.
Yes, I checked twice in my bag, and it was.
Yeah. So anyway, so here we are. This is in year 2, I believe, when we're putting in the tubing lines. Now, there are folks that can do this, just 1 or 2 people. Of course, we made a big production out of it, and we were learning as we went along to put the lines in. And here we are with some of our finished collection lines. Proud of our work. It was cold work, but it was fun doing it. And we did find when we went back to put in another set of lines, we looked over where we'd put in our first lines. This was in, again, early second week of January. And we found some lines down on the ground. And we went over and said, what happened there? And then we looked at where the T connector was, and it was all chewed apart like that. Some of you might be able to guess maybe what critter might do that. It had to be a pretty good size one, and it left footprints in the snow. And those are big footprints there. We had a black bear that came through and investigated. It's more interested in the tubing. And a lot of people think, well, it wants the sweet syrup and all that. Well, the sap isn't sweet. It's like drinking water. So the sap wasn't what it was interested in. But the oil content and some things in PVC piping and plastic is something that bears can sniff out, and they seem to enjoy the taste of it for whatever reason. Luckily, this guy moved along and didn't come back. I know of producers in some areas that have to put electric fence around their sugar bush in order to keep bears out, because they can be a real nuisance with their liking the tubing and all. But we only had that one encounter that year. Now, I think last spring when we went back to look at one site, we had some lines that were down, and we'd seen there were signs that there had been a bear over the summer that had come through and chewed up a couple of the lines. That's one thing about using these lines. They can stay up and be used for several years, unless a bear gets at them, of course. So here's a photo we took. We were feeding our lines into 55-gallon drums, and that made the collection process a lot easier. Of course, we still need to get a vehicle that would haul these up to our sugar shack, but this was much easier than emptying those buckets every 2 or 3 days and trying to go up and down the hill all those times. So that's a procedure that some of you that are into larger areas to tap might consider, especially if you have the mountain slopes like we have around here. Now, Richmond, you may not have that, but here in Southwest Virginia, it's ideal to use these collection lines like this. We talked a little bit about making other types of tree syrup. 2 years ago, our team Maple moved into the black walnut area. We tapped about a dozen black walnut trees, and made a small amount of very tasty syrup. Some folks thought that the black walnut syrup had a buttery flavor that was superior to some of the walnut syrup that was being produced in all. And we've tapped some walnut trees again. We found that at least what we think is the best time to do the black walnuts is to start tapping them about 2 weeks after we started tapping the maple trees. And we seem to get some pretty good sap flow on that. So that's an interesting product. We haven't done birch. I think Phil is doing some birch trees on his property. And we do have a speaker tomorrow who's going to talk more about making a syrup from birch. And sycamore is supposed to make a very flavorful syrup. And so that's our experiment this year. Sources tell us you want to tap the sycamores before you tap your maple trees, that these are tapped in November. And so that's what we're trying now to see if that's actually going to work for us. We'll be checking a couple of days, see if we got any flow. Of course, it's temperatures warmed up a little bit. So this is something we're learning about, and we'll be able to report on maybe next year. We're successful making sycamore syrup, you know. Just pointing out, when we did our walnut trees, we went to some sources. This is just one that we found. Cornell University had an article, gave us some information about doing walnut trees. Again, it's best to look at other state extension locations for information, learning from people who have been making syrup from other trees besides maples and all. And that concludes what I have to present tonight. I want to thank Phil with the Virginia Cooperative Extension. Without his enthusiasm and ideas for doing this, oops, back there, and also my fellow Virginia Master Naturalists. We call ourselves Team Maple. It's been a lot of enjoyable times working on this project, and also thank them. And this is the publication from Virginia Tech Extension, Cooperative Extension, on preparing maple syrup, particularly if you're looking to do it to eventually sell it, guidelines that they have, and Food and Drug Administration guidelines and all to make maple syrup. They point out that this publication is specific for maple syrup, so it would not refer to birch, alder, sycamore, and others, but there are some similarities, I'm sure. And I think, Phil, were you able to put that link in the comments to where
Yes.
they?
Yes,
Right.
that is in. I'll,
So I would, and I'm sure there are other publications from other states that will have similar information. If you're in some other location, you might want to talk to your local extension professional to see what information they have as to what are the best times for you to put in your taps.
Chris Woody had commented, he said a couple years ago when he was still using just jugs, he said a bear bit into one of the jugs, and he's kept it, I guess, good memento, but that's over in Harlan County, Kentucky. And I guess those of you who hunt and use trail cams, I know of a lot of people who've lost trail cams from bear damage, so they're attracted to that plastic, like Chris was saying. That applies across the board. You had a question here. Is food grade tubing recommended, or will any poly tubing be safe enough?
I think you want to get tubing that's specifically made for the maple industry. It's not very expensive. You can find this a lot of places, even places, I'm not putting it, but some of your online retail places will have little kits that if you're just doing 10 trees, they'll have a set of spiles with the tubing already attached to your spiles. Takes some of the fun out of it. You don't need the special tool then if it's already put together like that. And all, but the expense isn't that much. What we estimated that to do maybe 8 to 10 trees you're talking about maybe just the getting the plastic spiles and a little bit of tubing to do it. And then if you can reuse some of your milk jugs or other containers and all that, probably around $20 to $30 would be enough to get you started to produce some of your own syrup. Oh, of course, then you'd have the fuel. If you're using propane, you got to take that into account. Or if you're using wood stoves, the cooking of it is probably, it's my least favorite part, I guess, of the whole process. It's enjoyable getting out in the woods and putting in the taps and putting in the lines, and the collecting of it is not too bad getting outdoor, but just sitting around watching things boil. Of course, you can tell some good stories, but after a while, all the Team Maple stories have been told. So that's my opinion on the process. So anything that can speed up the cooking process is valuable, I think.
All right, a couple other questions. If you're going to leave the tubing up all year, I'm assuming you should still take the taps out of the tree,
Yes.
as we learned in the session.
Yes,
that's true.
In fact, we found out, we didn't realize the first year, but the little connectors that we have, the T connectors, have a little thing that's a little knob on. We thought, what is that for? What, it doesn't do anything. There's no sap flowing through that. Well, that's where you can take the end of your spile, and when you pull it out of the tree, and just clamp it onto that little thing. For some, of course, we cut off and put in new spiles each year, but it saves the tubing. We did have to find that there were places where a squirrel might gnaw on the tubing a little bit. So, and we'd flush the lines out. You could flush them in the spring, sometimes do that, or we flush them out in the fall, run some water through them. And then if we'd see leaks in the tubing, we'd have to go back and maybe do some repairs. Sometimes some good electrical tape or something around if it's just a small little puncture hole. And other times we just cut out a section of tubing and splice them together. So those are little things you learn with the tubing. But we were getting a couple years, 2 or 3 years use out of the tubing with some minor repairs. Tree limbs can come down, of course. That's why you need to check your lines, because even in the winter, get a heavy snow and a branch falls off, it can knock down your lines. So there are things that can go wrong, just like anything else in agriculture. And you're dependent on Mother Nature and the weather to a great extent. If you have a sudden heat wave and you go 2 weeks with temperatures in the 50s and 60s, you're not going to get any sap flow. And then if you have a polar vortex come through and linger on for more than just a few days, so that can slow down. So the people who are actually trying to make a living doing this, like anything else in agriculture, there are lots of variables involved, and weather is an important one.
There's a question about sterilizing the tubing, and I can say something on that if you'd like, Chris.
Sure, go ahead.
Well, what we found out from talking with other producers is it's about 50-50. If you go up Vermont and New Hampshire, some do absolutely nothing as far as sterilizing it, and some will take some steps. What a lot of people will do is they let the first flush of sap run out on the ground, operating under the assumption that sap's going to flush out bacteria and things like that. The biggest problem is that sap is really sensitive about picking up flavors and smells from other things. So you don't want to use anything like bleach. You don't want to use anything that can linger. What I've started doing on my few lines that I have at my house is I'll just take boiling water and I'll put it in a thermos or a couple of thermoses, and I'll carry it to the top, and I'll plug up the bottom, and I will it will use suction. It'll make use of that vacuum, and that hot water will come out, and I'll have it all plugged up, and I'll let it sit a day or so, and then release it at the bottom. And I feel like that, there may be scientists who would go in and say, "Oh, that's just that's not good enough," but I feel like it gets it clean enough. Now there are some cleaners that some of you may have experience with that may be things that would be useful that don't have a strong smell, but I just use boiling water.
And as an afterthought, we are boiling the sap unto its beyond its natural life. So anything bad in there will get sterilized anyway.
You know, that is true, but there's also, you want to cut back on any kind of bacterial contamination you can in the front end. But that is, we've made that comment, especially the first or year or two, that, hey, we're going to boil this anyway. You know, it's going to be sterilized. But yeah, you'll find lots of different theories about sterilizing those lines and cleaning those lines out there.
The bacteria can also maybe give the sap an off flavor that even cooking it won't remove. So that's another concern, that particularly if toward the end of the season and your sap is discolored and kind of yellowish and all, then there are going to be flavors in there that you probably won't want. It might be usable as a product, but it won't have the flavors that people like to have with their sap. And that's one thing, talk about flavors of maple syrup vary from location to location, kind of like your grapevines, that you have your different soils that give grapes their particular qualities in certain parts of the world. The syrup that is being produced throughout Appalachian region, there are some folks who claim, and I'm no taste tester or anything like that, but they've had some professional tasters and competitions, and many chefs prefer the syrup that's coming out of our Appalachian region in terms of the quality of some of the flavors when compared to about 80% of your maple syrup comes from Canada, and another large percent of US is coming from New England areas. There is syrup made in New York, there's syrup made in Ohio and some of the other northern states. When you think of maple syrup, most people think of Vermont and think of New England. But really, throughout our Appalachian Mountains, our higher elevations, the sugar maple has been thriving all the way down into North Carolina. And so there are some good productions taking place there. Now, sugar maples on the eastern part of Virginia, you're not going to find many of those naturally occurring. You will find other maples, but we have the area here through the Appalachians where the true sugar maples, which many will claim will produce your best syrup, we have those, provided the climate doesn't change too much in the next 20, 30 years. There's concerns about what will happen with the warming trends, how that might affect production. But right now, the sugar maples are there, and we have a lot of red maples as well in our mountains. So there's potential here for some people to make some money out of this. And that's one of the reasons why Phil was so interested in getting this started in our region, was to maybe help our local economy. And we do have some producers now. About the same time we were starting, there were some other folks that were starting production. We're not like Highland County in Virginia, but we're moving in that direction, I hope.
There were a couple of questions about the recording, and yes, I do plan to record the sessions tomorrow, Saturday. I will probably record those individually. So Joe Boggs' presentation will be one recording. Carl Nyland's will be one recording. Tom Hammett's will be one recording, and I'll just post those. And I'm going to put in here where you can find those. If you go to YouTube and you just go into the search and type in VCE Wise, you'll come up with our YouTube channel, and that's where those will be posted. Maybe Monday before we get all those posted, but that's where those will be. I would give you a link, but right now we've only got 17 subscribers, and you have to have 100 subscribers to get a nice condensed link to your YouTube channel. So it's about this long right now. So if you go into YouTube, go to the search and put VCE Wise, you'll come to our channel. Let's see. All right, Chris, we got another question. If you're a novice starter and only have a couple of trees, can you get enough sap from those couple of trees to justify trying this?
Well, let's see. What do you think, Phil? Because you've done some trees on your property.
I think so. I actually, down at my dad's place near Chattanooga several Christmases ago, tapped 3 red maples in his yard. And I was home for Christmas. I tapped those, and then I went back home. And I knew my dad well enough to know that he would just use it to taunt some of his buddies who said you can't make maple syrup that far south. But he made about a pint, I'd say.
Okay, yeah.
The textbook, as far as the flow goes, using buckets, they say 10 to 15 gallons per tree per season. So so with 3 trees, you could potentially get half a gallon or more.
Yeah. Yeah, I would think so.
Around Blacksburg, Phil, there are a lot of sugar maples planted in people's yards, at farms and in town. And a lot of people just tap 4 or 5 trees. And the students on campus are prone to stealing buckets. So the local kids, when they tap, they use ball jars and homemade spiles made from bamboo. And they're making syrup from these they go around every day and empty these ball jars. And they make syrup every year on just out of the ornamental trees planted on campus.
Yeah, that's cool.
Yeah, I think one of those pictures I showed when I was showing the spiles had that type of setup.
Yep.
Yeah.
So Chris, you're getting a lot of kudos, great presentation, a lot of thank yous for, and it was an excellent presentation. Thank you very much. Woody commented too, it's a very addictive thing, and I think all of us who've tapped would say the same thing. It is addictive. If you tap a couple trees, you'll be hooked. And one of the producers we have, our largest producer in Wise County, he started in 2016. He and his son did 10 taps with jugs, and I think last year he did 800 taps. So you just don't know when to stop.
Well, I enjoyed this tonight, and I appreciate the opportunity to do this. I say, without your leadership, none of this would have happened. So kudos to you, Phil.
Good volunteers. We couldn't have done it without good volunteers. So thank you all. And if any of the master naturalists have any closing comments, or Tom, do you want to say anything about tomorrow?
Yeah, thank you, Phil. But I want to echo the thanks that everybody else has expressed. Tomorrow's program is going to be certainly different. We're expecting, we have 3 outside speakers. We're really blessed with their interest in helping us out. And we will, as Phil said, tape those sessions. I was really glad to see 25 people on tonight. That's a great statement. We have 80 people that expressed interest in tomorrow. Hopefully we'll have time in between talks, questions. That's what we're planning on, but we're glad to see you all out, and looking forward to seeing some, if not all of you, tomorrow.
And Tom Allen wants to know if you're going to have beer for everybody.
Yeah, it'll be at my house. That's the problem, isn't it?
Is that going to be a maple stout?
Yeah, maple stout. I've got, well, here's what I'm going to be talking about tomorrow. I don't know if you can see it, but maple water. Okay. And so we got lots of things. One of our roles at Virginia Tech is to look for value added opportunities. And they asked me to talk a little bit about maple water. So all of our talks tomorrow will be really more of a dialogue or discussion, but we'll be looking for your examples and your experiences like we have seen tonight. So anyway, I look forward to seeing you tomorrow.
Yep, I'm looking forward as well.
Thank you very much. This was a great presentation. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Yeah, someone put maple water moonshine. I have seen on that moonshiner show that they did a couple things, I think, with maple syrup. And
there's maple flavored whiskey. It's on the market. I think it's made in Canada. I don't think it's very popular, But
There's a place that I saw recently come across my Facebook, probably because I've been Googling so much about maple syrup that Facebook thinks I must like things maple. And it was doing cocktail mixes. There's a place up in Vermont that was doing to make whiskey sour mix and some other things, but it was maple flavored and maple flavored bitters and things that they were doing. So that's another value added product to think about.